The air inside the terminal was thick with the sound of chatter and the shuffle of shoes against the polished floors. The man could feel it all around him, but not in the way others could. His cane tapped rhythmically against the ground, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. He was in his early 60s, now the years had caught up with him. But this flight meant everything. It was a chance to reconnect with his son after years of silence, years of waiting. His hand gripped the cane tighter as he approached the boarding gate, the soft hum of the overhead announcements blending with the low buzz of excitement from other travelers. When the call finally came, he stepped forward, slowly navigating through the crowd. By touch alone, the gates opened, the plane waiting beyond him, passengers bustling in both directions. A few people gave him glances, some with sympathy, some with curiosity, but most ignored him as if he didn't exist. He was used to it. But that didn't make it any easier. Today, of all days, he needed help to make this journey smoother, to avoid the sense of isolation that seemed to follow him like a shadow. But what he didn't expect was the attitude that would greet him when he reached the flight attendant standing at the entrance of the plane. She was young, a few years younger than his daughter, with her jet black hair neatly tied into a tight bun, her uniform crisp and perfectly pressed, as if she had just stepped out of a catalogue. Her eyes briefly scanned over him, as if checking him off on a list, but the moment he spoke, asking for help, she looked away, as if he were an inconvenience. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Could you help me find my seat and store my bag?" She glanced at him for a split second, then back at the aisle where other passengers were boarding. "Just ask someone else," she muttered under her breath, barely making eye contact, before moving on to the next group of people. He stood there frozen for a moment, the sting of rejection settling in. The words were sharp, cold, more cutting than he had anticipated. The sound of his cane tapping against the floor became louder now, as if mocking him. The bustle of the boarding process carrying on around him, as if he didn't exist. The crowd moved past him, and he slowly began to navigate his way through the plane. He tried not to focus on the feeling of being invisible, but it was hard not to when everyone seemed to be in a hurry to get somewhere else. He was just an obstacle to get around. His heart sank as he walked past the rows of empty seats and towards his own. A few passengers glanced at him with a mix of sympathy and discomfort. None of them spoke up, none of them offered to help, just silent faces watching him fumble through his task, each moment feeling like an eternity. The attendant who had refused him earlier was nowhere to be seen, lost in the chaos of settling passengers. The last few rows felt like miles away, but finally he reached his seat. It wasn't the one he had imagined. It wasn't the journey he had pictured. It was just him and his cane, the quiet of the cabin, his only companion. The flight was about to begin, but something in the air was different now, something that told him this wasn't going to be an ordinary flight. The plane began to taxi slowly down the runway, and the man could feel the subtle shift in the air as the engines roared to life. His hands tightened around his cane. The vibrations from the ground were like a pulse beneath his feet, and for a moment it almost felt like everything was falling into place. He tried to push away the sense of unease that had crept in earlier, but it lingered there like a shadow, an uncomfortable reminder of the way he had been treated. He was used to it, but it never made it easier. As the plane took off, the force pressed him back into his seat, and the sound of the wheels leaving the ground mixed with the hum of the engines. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, the rush of emotions flooding his mind, thoughts of his son, memories of days long past, how he had waited so long for this moment. It was supposed to be a new chapter in his life, but instead he felt trapped inside his own loneliness. The flight attendant's harsh words echoed in his mind, despite his best efforts to ignore them. The minutes dragged on, and the cabin slowly quieted as the seatbelt sign turned off. Passengers began to settle in, some lost in their own thoughts, others talking quietly among themselves. The flight attendant walked down the aisle again, her movements quick, her eyes scanning the cabin like a hawk. But she didn't meet his gaze this time. Either she moved past him, Without so much as a glance or focus elsewhere, as if he didn't even exist, it was as though his presence didn't matter, that he wasn't worth the time to look after. He tried to adjust his seatbelt without assistance, but his fingers fumbled slightly with the strap in frustration. He cursed himself silently. Why had he let her get to him? Why had he expected anything different? The seatbelt clicked into place. But the feeling of isolation remained heavy. He could sense the awkward glances of nearby passengers, the ones who couldn't help but look, but none of them spoke. Not a single person offered to lend a hand. He was invisible. Then the turbulence came sudden and sharp. The plane jolted once, a moment of discomfort, followed by another sharp jerk. The man's grip tightened on his cane, his heart rate quickening. As the plane shook, once more a few gasps escaped the mouths of nearby passengers, their faces filled with sudden panic. The overhead compartments rattled violently as bags shifted inside, and the attendant stumbled slightly. She regained her balance, but the chaos seemed to have unsettled her, just like the rest of the passengers. A few more bumps followed, and the air became thick with unease. As the plane continued to move through the storm, the flight attendants began to rush down the aisle trying to secure the cabin. But they were visibly flustered, not used to the intensity of the turbulence. The blind man held his ground, remaining calm through the chaos. But the plane shook again, harder this time, the sudden motion throwing the attendant off balance, her feet slipping out from under her. The flight attendant crashed into the man's seat, her body jerking forward. As she lost her footing, her hands reached for anything to steady herself. But in that moment, she collided with the man, his cane clattering to the ground. With a loud thud, her breath caught in her throat. As she quickly straightened herself, muttering an apology under her breath, she wasn't expecting this. She wasn't expecting the turbulence to worsen, or the sudden weight of everything crashing into her. The turbulence seemed to grow worse with every passing minute. The plane jolted and dipped again and again, and each time the man braced himself, he could feel his heart racing faster, his hands gripping the armrests. As the seatbelt sign flickered on again, passengers murmured nervously, their faces tight with fear, a few gasps escaping their lips. But through it all, the blind man remained eerily calm. He'd weathered storms before in his life, not just in the sky, but in the world around him. The flight attendant had regained her balance, but her composure was quickly slipping away. She rushed up and down the aisle, checking seatbelts, grabbing overhead compartments, closing them with more force than necessary. She was flustered, and the panic in her eyes was unmistakable. She was trying to maintain control of a situation that seemed completely out of her hands. The plane lurched again, and the loud clattering of baggage could be heard from above, causing a ripple of anxiety to spread through the cabin. The blind man could hear her footsteps as she approached again, the tension in her stride unmistakable. But this time, when she passed his seat, something shifted. He could feel her presence linger just a bit longer than before, her steps faltering ever so slightly, as if she was thinking of saying something to him. But then she moved on. No words exchanged, no eye contact. The silence between them felt more awkward than before. It was as if they were both trapped in the same moment, the chaos of the storm swirling around them, but neither of them able to escape. Then another sharp jolt hit the plane, so sudden, so violent, that a few passengers let out cries of shock. The overhead bins rattled so loudly that it felt as though the whole plane might come apart at the seams. The attendants scrambled to steady themselves, but their hurried movements only seemed to make things worse. The blind man's pulse raced again, but this time something inside him shifted. His mind focused, his thoughts sharp. As the sounds of distress surrounded him, he could sense the flight attendant getting closer once again, her footsteps stumbling under the pressure of the storm. Her body jerked violently as the plane dipped, and this time she was unable to regain her balance, in time her feet sliding out from under her. In a moment of panic, she fell forward, but instead of crashing into the aisle, she collided with the man's seat once again. The impact was strong enough that his cane flew out of his lap, and clattered to the floor beneath her feet. Her hands shot out in desperation to steady herself. But this time there was no avoiding the inevitable. The blind man's instinct kicked in. Without thinking, he reached out with surprising speed, grabbing her arm to stop her from falling fully into the aisle. His grip was steady and firm, his touch grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. Her breath caught in her throat as she found herself looking directly into his calm eyes for the first time. It was a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around them. She was breathless, but not from the panic in the air, but from the sudden realization that in this moment he had been the one to steady her. The turbulence seemed to momentarily subside, but the weight of what had just happened hung in the air between them like a question left unanswered. The blind man said nothing, his gaze calm and unwavering, but there was a quiet understanding in his silence. She finally gathered herself, looking away quickly as if embarrassed by the role reversal. But the message had been sent loud and clear. Karma had a way of appearing at the most unexpected moments and in the most unexpected ways. She straightened up and stepped back a little too quickly, as if retreating from an uncomfortable truth. But the moment lingered between them. The blind man simply adjusted his seatbelt and settled back into his seat, his breathing steady, his thoughts clear. Even in the face of such chaos, it seemed like he was in control more than anyone else on this flight. The turbulence seemed endless. The plane shook again, throwing everyone forward. The force was stronger this time, and the air felt thick with the panic of those around him. The blind man's grip tightened on the armrests, feeling the pressure build with each bump and jolt. He heard the frantic whispers of the passengers around him, their unease spreading like wildfire. But through it all he remained still, his breathing slow and steady. The calm in the chaos, it was something he had learned to master a long time ago. The flight attendant was back on her feet now, but her face was pale, her movements jerky and unsure. She passed by the blind man's row again. This time her eyes flicked nervously toward him, but she didn't meet his gaze fully. She hurried past him, avoiding the quiet presence that seemed to ground everything around them. She was trying to maintain control of a situation that had spiraled out of her hands. The overhead compartments continued to rattle as the plane dipped and swayed. She reached for the nearest seat to steady herself. But in that moment, the blind man felt a strange sense of clarity. Something within him knew that this moment held more weight than just the turbulence. She was struggling, and he could hear it in the way her steps faltered, in the way she rushed from one end of the cabin to the other without stopping to breathe. It wasn't just the storm outside, it was the storm inside of her, something she couldn't escape. No matter how hard she tried, the blind man could sense the shift in her movements as she neared his row again. This time she didn't avoid him, but stopped just a few steps away, as if unsure whether she should approach or keep her distance. The tension between them was thick, the kind that made the air feel heavy and the silence stiffening. His mind drifted back to the moment when he had steadied her, when he had reached out and saved her from falling. There had been no hesitation in his actions. Even though she had refused to help him earlier, he had still acted with kindness. The thought of it brought a quiet sense of peace to him. But it was clear that it had not been the same for her. She was struggling to accept the fact that she had needed him, the one person she had turned away earlier, now the one who had steadied her in her moment of vulnerability. He could hear her breathing heavily now, just a few feet away. He could sense her hesitation, the way she was unsure of what to do next, her mind racing with thoughts and emotions, the weight of the storm outside, and the storm inside pressing down on her shoulders. Her hands shook as she reached for a nearby drink, caught her focus, lost in the effort to regain control of her surroundings. But the plane shook again, and her hands slipped from the cart. She stumbled forward once more, but this time the blind man's hand shot out, instinctively catching her arm with a gentleness that surprised even him. She froze for a moment, the weight of the gesture sinking in, as he slowly helped her regain her footing. His voice was quiet but firm. "It's all right, just take a breath," he said, his tone calm and steady in the midst of the chaos. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment, her face flushed with the embarrassment of needing help, but then she nodded softly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as she took a deep breath. The turbulence began to subside, but the moment between them remained. The blind man's actions had done more than steady her physically. They had given her a glimpse into something she had been too busy to see before. Sometimes it took a storm to realize what was really important, and sometimes it took the kindness of a stranger to remind you of your own humanity. As the plane continued its journey through the skies, the flight attendant stepped back slowly. But this time she looked at him directly. Her gaze softened just a little, a subtle shift in the air. Between them the storm may have passed outside, but the storm inside her was still there. And she knew it wasn't just the flight that needed to land safely, it was her own soul too. The air seemed to shift again as the turbulence finally began to die down. The plane steadied its flight, but the weight of the moment between the blind man and the flight attendant remained thick in the cabin. He could still hear the soft murmur of voices around him, the relief as the passengers settled back into their seats, the fear in their eyes slowly fading as the storm passed. But the storm inside the flight attendant was far from over. He could sense it. She had stepped away from him after he helped her steady herself, but there was a hesitation in her movements. She wasn't as frantic as she had been earlier, but she was still lost in her own thoughts. She moved down the aisle again, this time more slowly, more deliberately, her steps quieter, her face still flushed from the embarrassment of needing help. But the blind man could feel something shifting within her, something that hadn't been there before. Her gaze flicked to him now, not in avoidance, but in recognition. It was subtle, but it was there, the understanding in her eyes, as if she finally saw him as more than just an inconvenience, a passenger to ignore, but as someone who had offered her a lifeline when she had been at her weakest. The flight attendant's hands were still shaking slightly, but she had steadied herself as much as she could. Her gaze lingered on the blind man for a moment longer before she moved on, but something in the air had changed between them. The power dynamic that had once been so clear had shifted. Her sense of control had cracked, and now she was left facing the vulnerability she had tried so hard to suppress. The blind man couldn't help but notice the shift. He had felt it in the way she moved, in the way she looked at him now, but he said nothing. He simply adjusted his seatbelt and sat back in his chair, letting the calm settle in around him. He had done what he could, and now all he could do was wait for the flight to finish. He wasn't expecting anything from her, no apology, no acknowledgement, just a quiet understanding between two strangers who had shared a fleeting moment of vulnerability. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to his row once again, this time with a tray in her hands. She didn't say anything at first, but there was something different in her demeanor, something softer, as she carefully placed a cup of water and a small snack on the tray table in front of him. The act was simple, but it carried weight, far more than any words she could have said. The blind man's fingers brushed the edge of the cup before he took a sip. The gesture was small, but it felt like a kind of silent truce between them. He didn't need anything grand, just a simple acknowledgement of what had passed between them. She stood there for a moment after placing the cup and snack down. Her eyes were no longer filled with the same panic they had once held. There was a gentleness in them, now a softness that hadn't been there before she met his gaze this time. Without hesitation, her voice was quiet, but steady. "Thank you." She said her words simple, but they carried an unexpected weight, a sincere gratitude that seemed to break through the walls she had built around herself. The blind man nodded slightly, acknowledging her words, but he didn't need to say anything more. The turbulence outside may have passed, but the turbulence within both of them had settled for now. Their moment of connection had come and gone, but it had left a lasting mark on both of them, a reminder that sometimes it takes a moment of vulnerability to see the humanity in others, even when it feels like the world is falling apart. As the flight continued and the cabin quieted once again, the blind man allowed himself to relax. The weight of the journey had shifted somehow. The fear and discomfort that had lingered at the start of the flight seemed distant now, not gone. But distant the flight attendant moved on to other passengers now. But there was a change in her step, a subtle difference in how she carried herself, like a burden had been lifted, even if just for a moment. The calm in the cabin seemed almost surreal after the chaos that had just passed. The passengers were speaking in hushed tones, some still gripping their armrests, others trying to distract themselves with books or headphones. The storm outside had faded into the distance, but inside the plane it had left its mark, especially on her, the flight attendant, who had been so sure, so composed now. Walked slower, spoke softer. Every step down the aisle felt more intentional, as if she was finally seeing the people around her, not just serving them. She paused at the back of the cabin and leaned against the wall for a moment, eyes closed, breathing deeply, her hands still trembling just slightly. The tray she held was empty, but her mind was full of thoughts. The moment the blind man had caught her, that brief connection had shaken her more than the turbulence ever could. It wasn't just about the fall. It was about everything that had come before it, about how she had treated him like he didn't matter, and how in return he had done what she had failed to do. He had cared. The blind man sat quietly in his seat, still as stone, but his mind was alert, his ears picking up every small shift in movement around him. He heard her footsteps returning, this time slower, more deliberate, when she stopped beside him again. There was no tray, no excuse, just presence. And for a moment neither of them said a word. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It carried weight, history, a kind of mutual understanding, forged not through words, but through actions. She finally broke the silence, her voice low, almost a whisper. "I judged you wrong." Her tone lacked its earlier sharpness now. It was honest, raw, unguarded. "I thought you were just another passenger," she continued, "someone who would slow me down, make my job harder. I didn't even look at you properly, didn't see you for who you are, and I'm sorry for that." The blind man tilted his head slightly, as if measuring her words with the same calm that had guided him through the chaos. He nodded once, and then spoke softly. "It happens more often than you'd think. People see what they want to see, or sometimes they don't see anything at all." Her throat tightened at his words, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. He hadn't spoken with anger or bitterness, just with experience, and that somehow made it hurt more. She stood there a moment longer, unsure of what to do next, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of resentment. But all she found was quiet peace, the kind that comes from someone who has faced much worse and survived. The intercom buzzed overhead, breaking the moment, the pilot's voice coming through announcing smoother skies ahead, and that drinks would soon be served again, the usual routine returning to the cabin. But something had shifted between them, something subtle yet undeniable. She gave him a small nod before walking away, this time, not as someone who had power over him, but as someone who had learned from him. As she moved down the aisle, her posture changed, her tone when speaking to other passengers changed. She started asking questions, looking people in the eye, offering help. Without being asked, it was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it was real, and those changes, though small, began to ripple through the cabin. The blind man leaned back in his seat, feeling the change too, not just in the air pressure, but in something deeper, something human. And for the first time since he boarded the flight, he allowed himself to smile just a little, because he knew something had shifted, not just for her, but for everyone who had been watching without ever saying a word. The hours in the sky felt slower than usual time, stretching between moments like soft threads, the kind that quietly pull at something inside you, and the blind man could sense that something was changing, not just in the tone of the cabin, but in the people within it. He could feel the way the footsteps of the flight attendant no longer rushed past him like he was part of the furniture, but instead lingered ever so slightly, as if acknowledging his presence without needing to speak it. Across the aisle, passengers who had once ignored him now glanced his way, their eyes not filled with pity, but with a quiet respect. Something had shifted, And though no one had said it aloud, he could feel it in the air like the first warmth of sun after a long winter he had spent a lifetime being looked through, as if blindness made him invisible. But today, for reasons even he could not explain, he was being seen. The flight attendant was handing out drinks again, her voice no longer mechanical, but warm, almost gentle, asking questions, like, "Would you like anything else? Are you feeling all right?" Her words landing softly on each passenger. And when she reached his row again, her hands paused slightly before setting down a fresh cup of water and a new snack. Without being asked, she placed them gently in front of him and spoke not loudly, not for show, but in a low, sincere voice, "I hope your journey today is a little better now." He nodded and thanked her, his tone quiet but kind, and she stood there for a breath or two, as if something more needed to be said. But she wasn't sure what it was, and maybe she didn't need to say it, because sometimes actions fill the silence better than words ever could. As she turned to leave, an older woman in the row behind leaned forward and tapped the blind man lightly on the shoulder, her voice soft, but filled with warmth. "I saw how you helped her earlier. That was very brave and kind. You didn't have to do that, but you did, and I just wanted to say thank you." The blind man smiled and nodded again, humbled by her words, but also quietly amused. He had never expected any of this. He had boarded the flight with nothing more than the hope of reuniting with his son, but instead he had become a silent teacher to those around him, reminding them not through speeches or demands, but through dignity, through patience, through humanity. And still the flight continued, clouds passing like slow waves outside the windows. The captain's voice soon crackled through the speaker, announcing that they would begin their descent shortly. Seat belts clicked into place once again, and trays were lifted as passengers prepared for landing. The energy in the cabin was different now, calmer, warmer, almost grateful. The flight attendant returned one last time to his row, bending slightly so he could hear her clearly, and she said something he hadn't expected, something that carried more weight than the flight itself. She said, "You reminded me of what this job is really about. I forgot for a while, and I'm sorry for that." The blind man didn't say anything right away, but he reached for the cup of water, took a slow sip, and then answered with a quiet voice, not angry, not proud, just honest. "You remembered, and that's what matters." And with that she smiled, a real one this time, not forced, not practiced, and walked away knowing deep down that karma had indeed come, but not to punish. Instead, it had come to teach. The plane began its descent slowly, the engines humming softer as the world below came closer, and the blind man could feel it in his chest, the change in altitude, the pressure in his ears, the subtle shift that told him this journey was coming to an end. But what struck him more than anything was the change he felt in the air around him. The tension that had followed him from the terminal through the turbulence had lifted like a fog, burned away by quiet acts of recognition and respect. The flight attendant walked with more purpose, now not because she had a job to finish, but because she had something to make right. And though no one else would know it, she felt it with every step. She had faced something within herself. On that flight, a truth she had tried to ignore, a lesson that had come not from a training manual or a supervisor, but from a man who could not see her, but somehow had seen her more clearly than anyone else had in a long time. The wheels touched the ground with a soft bump, and the cabin gently swayed as the plane rolled toward the gate. Passengers began to stir, unbuckling their seat belts, collecting their things, stretching their legs. But something was different. There was no rush, no impatient shuffling, no cold disregard for others. It was as if the flight itself had reminded everyone on board of something they had forgotten: how to notice, how to be present, how to simply care. The blind man sat still, waiting calmly for the crowd to thin out. He had no desire to push forward, no need to hurry, because he knew that what he had come for was waiting just beyond the gate, not just the reunion with his son, but the peace that came from knowing he had made a difference without ever asking for recognition. The flight attendant returned to him one last time, her voice low and calm, As she said, "If you'll allow me, I'd like to help you off the plane." She waited this time, not assuming, not commanding, just offering. And he nodded with a small smile, handing her his bag, and rising slowly from his seat, her hand gently guided his arm, steady and respectful, not rushed and not forced. As they walked down the narrow aisle, passengers turned to watch, some offering small nods, others simple smiles, but all of them changed in some quiet way by what they had witnessed, and not just the storm in the sky, but the one that had passed between two strangers, and left behind something stronger than the fear that once filled the cabin. When they reached the door, she paused, turned to him, and said, "I hope you have a beautiful reunion, and I hope I never forget this day." He nodded once more, his voice calm and steady, you will remember, because it mattered, and with that he stepped out into the jet bridge, the sounds of the airport rushing in around him. But for once he did not feel lost, he felt found. His son was waiting near the arrival gate, arms open-faced, lit with joy, a moment long overdue, and as the two embraced, the blind man allowed himself to finally let go of the weight he had carried, knowing that the journey had given him more than he had ever expected, not just a flight, but a reminder that even when the world is blind, to kindness never stops seeing.